So I'm David Evans. I'm Global Head of Healthcare for Schneider. I'm very lucky in my job. I get to travel the world working with healthcare providers specifically around driving change in net zero. So lots of things to talk about. And actually, I've had a strange career. I used to be a school teacher a long time ago. So I spent a lot of my career obsessing about behaviour change modelling. And actually, we're going to try and bring a bit of relevance for that today as well. So we've chosen to talk about sustainable retrofit as a component of net zero, the drive towards. So I'm just going to put that into perspective. Clearly we talk about sustainable. Now we've already had an explanation that sustainable and decarbonisation need to be segregated, but I'm going to talk mostly about decarbonisation, but I think you're right. In fact, we are going to change our corporate language around it for that reason. And why retrofit? And I'm just going to share an image. It's a bit grainy, but I couldn't resist using the graphic. Now, this isn't an NHS estate. This is actually Penn Med, University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. But it gives us a bit of a metaphor for the NHS, because you look at that sort of rather glorious building here, $1.5 billion investment in 500-bed extension of their cancer unit. How hard is it to make that a fully sustainable building? Actually, it's not that hard. Clever reference architectures, all very easy. But it doesn't interest me that much. What's interesting is everything else in shot. Sorry. Is that better?
We can't hear you.
It's my teaching background. I've got to keep moving, right? But all those other buildings in the shot need to be decarbonised. They're all going to be there by 2050, still in 2050, doing more or less the same thing. And actually, that's why I wanted to show the graphic, because the NHS is made up of heritage buildings, some fairly awful 1950s, 1970s buildings, some buildings that are protected. You can't put a screw in the wall without getting permission. And that's the challenge I think we're facing. So we all get our sort of, and we talk about bias, we all get really excited about the new hospitals. We might get 40 new bright spangly buildings, but we've got about 22,000 other buildings to turn into net zero. So that's what I sort of tried to bring out today. So let's look at the problem statement for a start. Kind of why do we care? We know that we're on a terrible trajectory. We know, we hear this sort of term all the time, we've got to get down to an average of 1.5 degrees increase. Let's just take a moment to think about what that means. The climate isn't a really nice constant thing. We've seen it this summer across the world. We talk about an average of 1.5, but actually there's two components of that average. One is kind of over time. So some years it might be 1.5, it might be 0. The following year it could be 3. So the average really is very deceptive. The other thing is, globally, and I'd never really given this much thought till recently, globally it's not 1.5 degrees everywhere. It might not be 1.5 degrees in our nice temperate northern hemisphere. West Africa are anticipating it being closer to 3 degrees on average. They think they'll lose 20% of their agricultural land by 2030 if we don't change it. I was working in Texas recently. It's a tough place to talk about climate change, actually, an oil town. In fact, I was actually uninvited to a conference after saying what I'm going to say. It's true. Because they're thinking there that they might experience something like 40 days at 40 degrees a year by 2030. So when we talk about, which is unlivable, and what's the implication? I was interested in the diagram that Frank shared there. What are the implications for health, water supply, and all of those things when you've got that type of climate intensity? And it's ironic because millions of people have been moving from the northeast of America down to Texas for the warm climate for the last sort of 30 years, and it's going to become unlivable very, very quickly. So let's put that into some perspective. That's about the total emissions from global healthcare systems. Now, we don't see many coal-fired power plants in the UK anymore. You go to other parts of the world, you see a lot of them. To give some perspective, if the healthcare systems of the world all came together and formed a country, that's our total emissions. That's about the same as Russia. As a country, healthcare would sit between Russia and Japan as a carbon emitter. So it's a colossal problem. And actually, we've got a colossal task ahead of us. And I'm just trying to frame it. I'm not going to be pessimistic. But it's interesting about the urgency. We've heard about sort of bias and the status quo bias, because actually we've been talking about this for ages. And we've talked about introducing sustainable technologies, and everyone gets really excited about them until they get to the CFO's desk and they run a calculator over it and go, well, it's not really a good return on investment, we're going to scrap it. But actually, it's not just about carbon anymore, because actually we're seeing this colossal increase in the price of energy. And the flip side is, actually, we've created a bit of an urgency to act, to break that status quo. And that's really a positive thing, because I was in a customer's site not far from here in London, and the estates director, we were talking about this stuff, and he actually stopped me. I knew him quite well. He said, Dave, I'm not being rude, but I'm just not interested. And we're talking about energy savings. He said, I'm listening to you, but what I'm really thinking about is the water running down the walls in the nurses' quarters, the fact that we have no CCTVs. He said, honestly, thanks for coming. Of course, then energy trebled in price and he called me back, because then it becomes a serious issue. So actually, we do have this pivotal moment. And what I'm going to try and do is just frame that in the context of this sustainable retrofit, because we need to get into a much more dynamic position the way we manage our energy. And we've got two critical enablers. We have to digitize, because in that way we can really automate and embed best practice and drive efficiencies. And we have to electrify. Why electrification? Well, because electricity is the only source of renewable energy. It's the only thing that we can do renewably. So we have to electrify our estates. But it raises a few questions. I'm just going to focus on three. There are more. Let's take the first question. Is there enough power in the grid or copper in the ground to electrify the healthcare estates? Well, it depends where you are in the country. We did some modelling in the northwest of England, and we looked at one provider who were looking at something like a 400% increase in the use of electricity if they electrified. And the utility provider just can't provide it. It's not there. And even if they could, what would that do, cost-wise? It's impossible. But it's only impossible if we keep using it in the same way and we don't deploy new technologies which could save that energy. And behaviour change, I think, is a cornerstone of that. I'm going to tease that out in a moment. The next problem we have is who's going to manage these complex electrical estates? Because we have a real crisis of recruitment of engineers into the health systems worldwide. I was on the island of Bermuda recently. Tough gig, right? Someone's got to do it. And I was talking to the entire facilities team supporting the health system on the island. And I was by far the youngest person in the room. They have absolutely no chance of replacing these people when they retire. And so they asked the question, it's like, can you just automate it? And actually, we can. We're going to run it from Canada, all digitally. We have to, because these people are just retiring. Now, it's not quite as bad in the NHS, but it's not far off. It's the same problem. And the other problem we have, and it was alluded to in the first talk here, is that we have these episodal investment cycles, usually, related to political cycles. Sometimes you get money, sometimes you haven't, sometimes you promise money, sometimes you don't get it. We all know about the backlog. How do you drive consistent change when you don't have consistent or plannable foreseeable income streams? And it's a big problem. So I'm going to come up with a few key drivers around this, and we're going to focus on the retrofits stage, because actually that's where I think we should put our energy and our horsepower to start with. A lot of other things that can require a change. But essentially, we know that 70% of the carbon out of those 512 coal-fired power stations we're talking about come from the way we operate and maintain the existing estate. So what we have to do is say, well, okay, that's 70%. That's pretty good. So we could take out 350 power stations with a little bit of technology if we do it properly. And where does that, what does that imply? I'll share this slide because it takes a bit of digesting. But what we've tried to do is work with some building physicists to say, well, okay, how much can we really take out of that carbon working with technology in buildings if we retrofit them. Now, I'll let you digest the slide, but essentially it's about 2/3, or about 70%. So actually, when we sort of say we need a 400% increase in electricity, actually you don't. We maybe get that down to 35% increase, because we can do things better and differently, reuse the embedded carbon in a more efficient way, and then we have to sort of, so if we just take that figure, call it 70%, it's a bit misleading. It's 70% in a nice consistent world, like an office building. Hospitals tend not to fit that category, but it's about 2/3, somewhere around there. Okay, how do you achieve that 2/3 saving? Because everybody would want it. There's tens of millions of pounds of energy saving, gigatons of carbon. We've got to do it. But we have to really sort of build these ROIs, these sort of, the business case. We have to be able to compare the investment in technology with the investment, say, in double glazing, or investment in extra insulation, or just simple stuff. So we're trying to do that, and there's a link there, shameless plug, to a white paper with some colleagues from a consultancy firm to kind of explain these relationships between investments in technology and investments in building fabric and other things. Because we have to resolve this dilemma. And I'll just sort of give an example. If you sit in sort of any health trust around the world and you put everybody in a room, you get the sustainability director talking about how they're going to have electrification of patient movements, they're going to fully electrify the estate, everything's going to be good. And the other side of the table, you get the facilities director saying, oh, no, you're not. We can't have that, we can't afford it, we can't maintain it, it's super complicated, how can it be done? The answer is it can be done, but we have to really think. And there's a 3-stage plan to that thought process. And I'm going to tease these out. It has to start with strategy. People really need to know where they're going beyond one political cycle. Now, I'm going to, we can measure the baseline and we do all of that stuff. You could get a decarbonisation roadmap, and most people, most health providers in the world outside of Texas are kind of on that, are on that pathway. The most important thing for me, and the number one takeaway for leadership, is the third point there: prescribe minimum design standards. If we actually set minimum design standards for electrical and mechanical estates and other technologies into building plans as non-negotiable components that can't be ripped out, then we have a chance that when the estates grow, they can be managed digitally to enhance performance, to optimize stuff. One takeaway from the whole conference for me would be prescribe. Get those design standards set. I was at a conference a couple of months ago, and there was a cost consultant talking about cost management, and it's a pretty dry subject to have a bit. And she stood up and she was talking about having these non-negotiable components of a specification prescribed, locked in, standing ovation. Because people who live in this world know that's the only way that you can build a heritage and build a manageable estate. So once you've done that strategy piece, you just have to digitize. Then you can monitor, you can report, you can identify savings opportunities, and you can do some really smart things. You can actually look at patient movement and actually manage the simple stuff like lights and HVAC around patient movement, room occupancy, bed occupancy, and so on. It's not that hard, honestly. Once you actually start looking at the relationships in a hospital and looking at workforce telemetry and all of those things and relate it to what you're doing in a room, turning the heat down when there's no one in it, turning the lights off, it's amazing the savings you can make. We're talking, with relating, for example, HVAC to patient movement in an operating theatre is about £12,000 a year per theatre of energy saving. That's a lot. And that's really easy to achieve if you digitise. And from there you can decarbonise. So let's bring out that as an action plan. In strategise there, I've got prescribe, and never ever compromise. This is what we need from our leaders. This is what powers behaviour change. I mean, looking at the COM-B model there, we talk about capability. Capability, we have to build that capability for our estates team, and that's where we want our leaders to bed this prescription in. And you need to define your data strategy. We've been sold a bit of a dream over the years, right? That, don't worry, we'll stick all the data into a data lake in the cloud and we'll work it out later and, try and use it. Absolute nonsense. If you think that some sort of magic netbot's going to go into the cloud and start extracting data and build the relationships and try and join disconnected systems, it's probably not going to happen. We have to work with technology providers from across the spectrum. We have some sort of friends here, some colleagues in from Microsoft today. Actually, their world and the buildings world needs to join up. We need that data plan. Then we digitize. We can track the embedded carbon. We can measure and monitor energy reduction. It's relatively easy to do this. Actually, what we need to do is do it in the context of other variables like, detergents and laundry and other sustainability, human movement. But let's just focus on decarbonisation for a moment. Everything needs to be upgraded. But we know it has to be done episodically. Every so often you get some money and you get an upgrade, you get a retrofit. The only way to actually manage that long term, so that in 2050 we have a manageable estate, is to have those minimum design standards, a common data strategy, and the rest can kind of work itself out. There'll be ups and downs, but essentially what we need to do is work out where to put the horsepower, and it's a relatively easy problem statement. We look at the existing estate and we deploy technology to take out about 70% or so of the carbon. And the only way to do that is to have those design standards set in stone, non-negotiable, and then we build a heritage for the next generation of estate users. Because, go back to the first slide there with that big smart new building, the 1.5 billion. They've actually said that's going to be there for 100 years. That's their foundation for the next 100 years. If we start having disconnected systems, closed systems, and no data strategy, actually in 100 years' time, we're going to have the same problem. Okay. We're here all day. If you'd like to come and have a chat, I will do. Thanks for your time.